Welcome to Trex Academy, where you can learn everything you need to know about building your deck project. I'm Devin, and in this video, you'll learn how to properly flash and attach your deck ledger. As you can imagine, of all the critical framing connections, the flashing and attachment of your ledger is the most important. In fact, many of the catastrophic deck failures that you'll see are either due to an improperly attached ledger board, or maybe it was attached correctly, but it wasn't flashed correctly, which can lead to water getting behind your ledger and actually rotting out the rim board of the house, which can lead to that structural failure. All right, with those important notes covered, I think we're ready to move on to our first step. So the first step you'll always need to do when attaching a ledger board to the house is going to be to expose an area large enough to accommodate backflashing above, behind, and below that ledger board. So the amount of area you need to expose is going to be determined by your local municipality. And in our jurisdiction, that's going to be 6 inches above. Again, that'll go behind the ledger board and be 3 inches below. Okay, so you can see here we already have our backflashing installed, and that's because when we removed the original ledger board, the existing deck, we found a lot of rot in our sheathing, and that's because there was no flashing whatsoever. So we replaced all that sheathing, installed our butyl membrane, and that's going to be the first defense for both our sheathing, and ultimately it's going to protect the rim board of the house. Well, since we already have our backflashing installed, it's time to move on to the next step. Now we need to verify the height of our ledger board. So our beams are already installed, and the height of those beams was determined by our desired location for our ledger board, which, as you can remember, we found that by measuring 7 inches down from the underside of our threshold here. We've got a mark right there at that 7 inches, and we measured 1 inch up. That's going to be the finished height of our deck with a 1 inch deck board. What we'll end up with is a 6 inch step down, which is the original height of the deck. Okay, so I've been checking as I've worked just to make sure everything lined up and everything's good so far. But since this is the last chance that we have to make sure that we get the exact location of that ledger board, we're going to be extending that beam height back to the house. In this case, we're going to use our joist material, which is going to be a 2x8. So we'll pull this up against the house right up to our line. That looks perfect. All right, so now we just need to do the same thing on either side of the deck. So the last thing we need to do in this step is to snap a chalk line all the way across to indicate the top of our ledger board. So since I'm working alone, I'm going to set a screw right at that mark that we made right here for the top of our ledger board. Now I'm going to pull out my chalk line, and then I'll be attaching that hook, be hooking that right onto the fastener. Let's go ahead and walk it all the way down to that inside corner. Once I get there, I'm going to line it up with that mark. I have a similar mark over here, again representing the top of that ledger board. Go ahead and pull it taut. I'm going to reach out as far as I comfortably can and pull it straight out. Okay, so I generally like to snap it twice, just in case there were some bubbles or wrinkles in our membrane. All right, there we go. It's looking really good. Time to move on to the next step. So now we're ready to determine the length of our ledger. But we do have a few variables that we need to think about whenever we're planning this. So in our case, we've got a staircase coming off the front of our deck. We'll also have guardrail posts around the front and the sides. And finally, our deck is roughly 22 feet wide, and deck boards aren't available in lengths greater than 20 feet. But if you're not dealing with any of those variables, you don't have a staircase coming off the front, no guardrail posts, and your deck is less than 20 feet, then your first step is going to look a little bit different. So your first step in that case is going to be to measure the length of your beam. And that measurement is going to give you exactly what the length of your front rim joist should be. Now to get that ledger length, which is what we're really after, you subtract 3 inches from the length of that front rim joist or the length of your beam. And to show you exactly why we're subtracting 3 inches from the ledger, made a quick little mock-up. So we've got our front rim joist, see our side rim over here. Finally, we have our ledger. So you can see that we're actually set in by 1.5 inches to attach to the outside of our ledger board. And we'll be doing that on both sides. So that'll be -3 inches on our ledger board. All right, so you're probably wondering why I have my front rim joist and my ledger resting on top of my beam. Honestly, the main purpose of this is just to give you a better visualization, because these will be the position that they're going to be installed, with our ledger board attached to the house and then our front rim joist installed at the front of the deck. So my next step is going to be to mark the center of my deck. The reason I'm doing that is, as I mentioned before, this deck is 22 feet wide, and deck boards don't come longer than 20-foot lengths. That means in every row, I'm going to have at least 2 deck boards. Now the way I install that can be different, and in fact there are a couple different options. One being to have all of your butt joints stagger in each row, or you can do what I commonly like to do, and that's to install a breaker board right down the center. So that way, if I do that, I know that the deck boards on each side of that breaker board are going to be equal lengths, and then they'll just intersect into that breaker board. So now I'm going to go ahead and make that mark for the center of my deck. I know that the center mark for my beam is going to be 127 7/8 inches. So I need to transfer that mark to both my front rim joist and my ledger board. Okay, so we've got the center of our deck marked. Next thing I'm going to do is extend that line back across my ledger board. Okay, and remember the purpose of finding the center point was to make sure that we had support for our breaker board. So when we're adding that breaker board in, we need to have a joist on each side. And since I know that the width of a deck board is 5.5 inches, I'm just going to start by putting half of that, which is 2 3/4, right here. I'll make a mark right there and another mark at 5.5 inches. Okay, so that's representing the outside of our joist. I'm going to go ahead and extend these lines. And the next thing I'll do, just to help you better visualize what we're really looking at, is I can make marks 1.5 inches away from that. That'll show you exactly where the joists are going to be placed. Do one right here, same thing over here, 1.5 inches. Transfer those lines. And now everywhere that you see an X, we're going to have a joist land. In fact, we'll go ahead and bring up a scrap piece of our deck material. But not only do we need support for our breaker board, we also have to support the board as it comes up. So this is going to be intersecting that breaker board, and we're going to have to add a joist on either side of the 2 joists that we already have. But when we're doing this, I like to leave a 1/2 inch gap, and that's just to allow for airflow or water and for debris to just flow through instead of getting trapped right there. So same kind of process to do this. We'll go 1/2 inch over, make a mark right here. And then we know the thickness of our joist material is 1.5 inches. So we'll make another mark there. Same thing on this side, 1/2 inch, and then 1.5 inches. So now we can transfer all these lines following the same process. And remember, typically I wouldn't go this far, but this is just to show you where all of our joists are going to land. Okay, so there we go. So now we have a visual representation. These joists will run all the way from the ledger at the house to the front of our rim joist. And again, I'll bring back in our scrap piece that we have just to show you that we're fully supported on the breaker board, and the ends of our deck board are fully supported as well. So now that we have this marked out, we're ready to move on to finding the locations of our guardrail posts, but just on our front rim board, again, just to make sure we don't have conflicts with our joist. So we're going to start with this first end post. We know that it's going to be right near the end, but it's going to be set 1.5 inches back. And that's because we're going to have our rim board or a rim joist placed right here, and that first post will be just inside that corner. So that'll be roughly right there. So to find our next post location, we're going to refer back to our plans. I'm going to measure 45 inches away from the edge of our deck, which will be the edge of our framing. Make a mark right here at 45. Okay, and that's going to be the inside edge of that post. So I'll go ahead and get one of my mock-up 4x4s here. Just make a mark on both sides. Here we go. All right, so now it's important to also mark the center. Measure at 1.75 inches. Doing the same thing, transferring that line all the way across. Okay, there we go. All right, so once we have both of these post location, at least according to our plans, we know this is going to be the top of our stairs, which are going to come out of the front of the deck. All right, from this point, we need to measure from that center mark that we made all the way down to the center of our end post. And once we have that measurement, we're going to divide that up into sections less than 72 inches because 72 inches is the max span of our railings. So since I'm working by myself, I'm going to attach a fastener or a screw right here on the front. I'll be able to hook my tape measure and run it to the end. Okay, there we go, just like that. Okay, looks like that measurement is 205.5 inches. All right, so again, that measurement is from the center of our end post to the center of that inside stair rail post. Okay, so with that measurement, we need to divide that up into equal sections that are equal to or under 72 inches. Again, that's our maximum rail span. So I'm gonna go ahead and get my phone out, get the calculator here. So 205.5. I think we could do 4 sections. That'll give us 51.37. So that is under 72 inches, but I think we could actually try one less section. So 205.5 divided by 3. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so that'll be 68.5. Again, that'll give us 3 equal sections of that measurement of 68.5. So that'll be from the center of this post to right in here at 68.5, and we'll go all the way down to that stair rail post. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these out first. After that, I'll come back and mark the locations for all of our joists. And that way we know we don't have any interference between our joist and our post. So now we're ready to find the location for our joist. That's going to be relative though to the post locations that we found to make sure they don't run into one another. So I've got a clamp in position. I'll be using that as a helping hand. This is also a good time to point out why I put my front rim joist and my ledger in this vertical position right next to each other. And that's as I work my way down, I'll be able to mark my joist from front to back. So it'll be marked on both, which I'll have to be doing anyway. Go ahead and hook my tape on here. And I'm looking for every 16-inch on center when I come in contact with a post. Let's go ahead and pull it down. My first post here. Got a joist here. I'll have a joist here. So this one's good because the post is in between those marks. Before I get to that next post, I need to stop right here because this is where I have the joist laid out for my breaker board. So I know I have a joist at 112. My next joist will be here, so I'm under 16-inch on center, which is great. Got the same thing going on over here. Got a joist at 132 and then a joist at 144. Again, under 16 inches on center. That's in good shape. And my post is in between both of those. All right, let's go ahead and work down to the next post. Okay, and this is exactly why we lay out the locations of our post before we lay out and attach all of our joists. So we actually do have an interference. We have a post location. Again, this is the post for our stairs, right at the point where we want to have a joist. But this is an easy fix. We just need to move it over to the side of our post. And if we hadn't done this at this point, you'd have to come back, tear out that joist and reposition it. But you might also have to move the rest of your joists in line. Luckily in this case, we're towards the end, but imagine if that was in the middle, you have to move a whole lot of joists. Okay, so I've got the line for the edge of my post. Just mark over 1.5 inches. There. Extend that line across. There we go. Okay, so now I know where my joist is going to be. A couple things we have to think about. I was doing 16-inch on center, and since my next 16 was going to be around here, that means my next bay would actually be above 16-inch on center. So we need to reset the process from here. I'll just be measuring off the side of that joist that I positioned all the way to the end. All right, we're in good shape right to the end. So the next thing I need to do is I'll go ahead and mark all of the layout for our joist. Then I'll transfer that mark down the face of both the front rim joist and our ledger board. All right, so I just finished marking and transferring the locations of our joist down the inside face of that front rim and across the entirety of our ledger. So the next thing I need to do is lay out the location for my fasteners. This is a point where you really need to go back and talk to your local jurisdiction because they're the ones that are going to dictate exactly where your fastener should fall. So I know in my jurisdiction, I need to start with 2 screws on the end, 2 fasteners. They'll be 2 inches in. Let's go ahead and make a mark there. I'll just transfer that line across. Okay, there we go. From here, again, you'll have to refer back to your jurisdiction. In my jurisdiction, since I'm using a 2x8, I know that I need to be 2 inches down from the top for my first row. Put a mark there. I have a second row that needs to be a minimum of 4.5 inches down from the top. But in our case, we're going to be going 5 1/4. So that'll work right there. But again, if you have a different material that you're working with, it could be a 2x10, 2x12 for your ledger, your joist, and your rim, your pattern could look a lot different than this. All right, so my next step then is to extend those lines all the way across the entirety of that ledger board. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to be using my speed square, using the same method that I did for my beam when I extended a line across that. Let's go ahead and put this in position, and I'll be putting my pencil right at that 2-inch mark, dragging that all the way across. I'll come back and do the same thing for that 5 1/4 inch mark for the bottom row of fasteners. So I've established those lines for the top and the bottom of where I know all of my fasteners are going to go. So again, that was 2 inches down from the top, and then 5 1/4 inches for the bottom. So the next thing I need to find is going to be the spacing and the pattern that I'll need to use for my fasteners. So again, I need to refer back to my local jurisdiction because they're the ones that are going to determine that based on the type of fastener that you use. So there are a few different options that we have for approved fasteners in this jurisdiction. And one of those, it's pretty common, a 1/2 inch lag screw with a washer. In fact, this was the application used to attach the ledger that was attached to this house before we demolished it. So another option that you'll find that is approved in this jurisdiction is going to be a 1/2 inch through bolt. So this will go through your ledger, through the rim board of the house, and then be attached with a washer and a nut on the back side. So again, another option approved in this jurisdiction, and the option that we'll be using for the deck are going to be these 4-inch Simpson strong tie SDWS timber screws. So with this fastener in mind, we go back to our jurisdiction and we check the spacing. And in this jurisdiction, that's going to be 22 inches on center in a staggered pattern. So we'll have a fastener here, and then 22 inches will go down, up, down, repeating that pattern all the way across the length of our ledger board. So let's go ahead and get started and lay out that pattern. So we already know we have the mark for our first 2 fasteners at 2 inches in from the end, but instead of measuring 22 inches, 44/66 all the way across, I've got a scrap piece of wood that I've cut to that 22 inch length. I'll go ahead and set it where I know our first fastener is going to be. Then I can make a mark for the position of that top fastener. It's also important to note that as I'm doing this, it's really helpful because it'll show me any points that I have where a fastener might be falling underneath a joist or a joist hanger. So we've got that first one marked. Pick up my square, make that mark all the way across, and I'll just put an X right here to indicate where that fastener is going to go. Okay, I'll keep working down, moving my joist hanger along, again, just to make sure I don't interfere. And look at that, surprise, surprise. So we have run into a problem here, but it's not much of a problem because again, we're pre-planning. So since that fastener would have been underneath the joist hanger, instead, all we need to do is move it about 1 inch away. Make a mark here at 1 inch away from that, make my mark, and now you can see the fastener, the first fastener in our bottom row. So this is also important to know that when I moved it, I moved this closer to that 22 inch spacing, so now I'm less, which is perfect. If I would have tried to go the other direction, I would have been greater than that maximum, and that would not have been code approved. So now we're just going to keep repeating this process. I'll be moving this along, and now every time that I run into an interference like this, I'll have to reset that 22 inch mark at that new mark. Okay, I look good there, so I'll just move this out of the way. And since this one's going on top, I'll transfer that mark back. And now you can really start to see that pattern come to life. We've got one here at the top, another fastener at the bottom, another fastener at the top, and so on and so on. So let's just keep continuing this process. So I've got the holes pre-drilled on the end because in Simpson's evaluation report, they dictate that if these fasteners are within 6 inches of the edge of our ledger, then we have to pre-drill. But remember, our jurisdiction requires that those fasteners be 2 inches in the end. So we did have to pre-drill for that, but now we're good to go for the rest until we get to another end. So now I'm just going to be setting all of my fasteners because it's a lot easier to attach them in this position than it is to do it when they're up against the wall. Just going about an inch in, not going all the way through. Again, this is just to help us out, make it a little bit easier. Okay, so I've got all my timber screws set in our ledger board. Next thing I'm going to do is move back to the house to the back flashing. As I've been working, I've made some holes in that back flashing. Now I'm going to go back and patch all of those just using some cutout pieces that I have of the same material. It's that butyl membrane. Just put those right on there, working my way all the way down. And the real purpose of this is, obviously we have our back flashing, so if water comes down, it's protected, but leaving these penetrations, water can still get in there. So this is to protect the sheathing and to protect the rim joist behind it. Okay, so after I get all these done, I'll come back and snap 2 chalk lines. One's going to signify the bottom of our ledger board, and the other I'll explain next. Okay. So we snap those chalk lines. Remember, this bottom line is going to be the bottom of my ledger board, and then 3 inches up from there, I have the top of my flashing. So I'll show you exactly the type of flashing we're going to use for this installation. So here I've got a piece of steel ledger flashing. This will go again just here with the top of that flashing lining up with that line. But there are different types of flashing you can find. You can find vinyl, copper, and even aluminum, but I really wouldn't recommend that you use aluminum because it is prone to corroding if it comes in contact with the wood preservative found in pressure treated lumber. All right, so now that you know the material we're going to be using, I'm just going to show you a quick mock-up of what this entire assembly is going to look like. All right, so back at the wall, again, this will line up just like this with the top of our first piece of flashing lining up with that line. After we set this in, tack it in place, we're going to come back and add 3-inch butyl membrane just to make sure water can't get back behind there. Next, we'll be attaching our ledger board just like that, and then we just repeat that process, adding another piece of that steel ledger flashing on top. Go just like that. Same thing as before, I'm adding that butyl membrane on top of that, and with the entire assembly created, you can see that as water comes down, it'll be forced over the top of the flashing, over the top of our ledger, and then instead of flowing back behind right here, now our steel flashing at the bottom is going to force that water out, cause it to drip over our siding. All right, so with that out of the way, the next thing I'm going to be doing is installing some more wood blocking, just like I have here in the center, and that's going to work as a helping hand to support the weight of the ledger as I attach it. So obviously, after I attach this, I need to make sure I install that steel flashing before I attach my ledger. So I'll attach all of that steel flashing, add that 3-inch membrane on top of that, and then I'll be ready to attach the ledger. So we've got our first piece of that steel ledger flashing installed, and then I installed this 3-inch butyl membrane on top of that. So with all of our planning out of the way, and with this first piece of flashing, we're finally ready to move on to attaching the ledger board to the house. But one more thing I need to remind you of. In this case, we measured 6 inches down from the threshold of our door, and that's going to be the top of the deck. That's the same position the top of the deck was for the original deck, so we know that it's going to be fully supported. So I'm going to go ahead and install this ledger to the house. Obviously, I'll come back and put that larger piece on next, and after that, I'll come back and add this same steel ledger flashing that I used on the bottom and apply that to the top. After that, I'll be using that butyl membrane, run that all the way down. Okay, and once the ledger is finally finished, it'll be time to install our joist. But before I can do that, I actually need to install some landscaping fabric throughout this area, as well as some gravel. That's just going to help mitigate weeds as well as help with soil erosion. All right, so for now, just need to go ahead and get this installed. We've attached and properly flashed that ledger board, then we came back and installed that landscape fabric and put gravel on top of that. So our next step is going to be to start installing our joist. If you'd like to see a video on that and the entire deck building process, you can go to trex.com/academy. Thanks for watching.